Okay, we're going to get started here. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Kathy Blackwell, and I'm the president of the Board of Trustees of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this month's Words, Writers, and Southwest Stories presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and our beloved Log House Museum are located on the traditional lands of the Duwamish people, past and present. We are grateful here at the Historical Society to the Duwamish peoples, Seattle's first people, for stewarding this land throughout the generations. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank our partners at the Seattle Public Library who helped sustain this series, as well as Humanities Washington, who provided us with our distinguished speaker tonight. And thank you too to our sponsors, For Culture, Luna Park Cafe, Home Street Bank, the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center, and Always West Seattle. Their generosity make these free experiences possible for all of us. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us. If you're joining us for the first time, we ask that you please use the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen for our question and answer session this evening. And you can submit your questions during the presentation, and our speaker will answer the questions at the end of his presentation. And so now I would like to welcome Dora Faye Hendricks, who is the chairman and longtime chairman of the Historical Society's Words, Writers, and Southwest Stories, who will introduce our speaker tonight. So Dora Faye, welcome.
Thank you, Kathy. And again, welcome to all of you. Tonight, our speaker is Ross Reynolds. He's a veteran broadcaster. Probably some of you have heard him and know him. He explores the impact that audio transmission has had on society and storytelling, beginning with the first century of radio up to the modern age of audiobooks, internet streaming, podcasts, and smart speakers. Although we live in a visual world, audio still has the power to create intimacy and spark the imagination like no other medium can. How has audio transmission changed society, and what makes it such a still powerful form of communication? Ross Reynolds is an interviewer, moderator, and convener. He lives in Seattle. He will present us with his bio, and recently served as KUOW's executive producer for community engagement, before which he was a program host for 16 years. His awards include the 2011 Public Radio News Director's first place in the call-in category for living in a white city. In 2015, he was named to the University of Washington Communication Alumni Hall of Fame. Thank you for being here, Ross. It's all yours.
Great, thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate the chance to talk about something that I'm passionate about, which is audio and sound, and particularly transmitted sound. Along with the credentials that were already presented, I should share my most cherished credential. I am an honorary seafarer pirate. My pirate name is Rotten Ross. I've been working in radio and audio for 34 years as a talk show host, program director, a producer. I produced stories for the BBC, for NPR. And so I've always been fascinated by our toolbox, those of us who work in radio. Garrison Keillor once said of television, it's all contained in a box, but radio is as big as your imagination. In 1963, radio people felt threatened by this box of television. Radio was thought to be dying. The comedian Stan Freberg made an advertisement for the power of radio and the power of audio.
Too bad about radio.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, since television, you know, hardly anybody listens to radio anymore.
Oh, I wouldn't worry about that if I were you. There's a radio in use for every man, woman, and teenager in America.
Really? Gee, I'd hate to think of them all turning them on at once.
They do. Every morning.
Who listens to radio? That go where you go medium called radio.
Radio? Why should I advertise on radio? There's nothing to look at, no pictures.
Listen, you can do things on radio you couldn't possibly do on TV.
That'll be the day.
All right, watch this. Okay, people, and now when I give you the cue, I want the 700-foot mountain of whipped cream to roll into Lake Michigan, which has been drained and filled with hot chocolate. Then the Royal Canadian Air Force will fly overhead towing a 10-ton maraschino cherry, which will be dropped into the whipped cream to the cheering of 25,000 extras. All right, cue the mountain. Cue the Air Force. Cue the maraschino cherry. Okay, 25,000 cheering extras. Now, you want to try that on television?
Well, of course, today, television and movies can easily recreate Lake Michigan filled with hot chocolate and a maraschino cherry on top, or the destruction of Los Angeles in an earthquake, as they did, or Paris Street rolling over on itself like it did in the film Inception. But sound taps into imagination and emotion in ways that visual stimulus does not. And perhaps that's because, as media theorist Marshall McLuhan famously said, the medium is the message. And by that, he meant the way the message is conveyed can be just as important as the content of the message itself. If you read the words "she wept," that's very different from hearing the sound of a woman weeping or seeing a film of a woman weeping. Television, books, and the internet, they're all very different media. And each medium shapes us in different ways. We create communications media, and by using those media, they create and affect us. For example, using the internet and social media seems to have shortened our attention spans to tweets and 60-second videos on TikTok. How do you think media shapes us? Think about that, and we want to talk about it a little bit later. TV and internet are what Marshall McLuhan would call hot media. That means they contain a lot of information. A hot medium saturates your senses. Audio, particularly low-quality audio like phone calls, is what McLuhan would have called a cool medium. It provides less information, and as a result, our brains need to work a little bit harder. We turn the sound into pictures in our minds. That's why all forms of audio, from radio drama to books on tape to podcasts, can be so effective. Here's an example from the New York Times radio show and podcast, The Daily. A couple of years ago, they asked people to talk about the best thing that happened to them during the pandemic.
This is Chris from KUOW Arena, North Carolina. In 2017, me and my wife got married, and that following year, in spring of 2018, we started to try and have a baby. And there were quite a few roadblocks that we encountered, fertility specialists, so on. And this Monday, I came downstairs to head to work, and my wife was at the kitchen table with a positive pregnancy test. It's the world to me. It's honestly really made this year worth it. We are both so happy and so thrilled. We just can't wait to have a family.
Hi, this is Leslie Kretz, and I live in Milton, Ontario, Canada. And the best thing that happened to me this year was the birth of my son, Nathan, on February 10th. So he's 10 months old today.
My wife and I welcomed our first son this year.
We welcomed twins in February of this year.
I had a baby girl.
A baby boy.
We welcomed our first baby.
Our first child.
Isabel.
Lucy May.
Sophia.
Maeve. Lillian.
Enuma Elish.
We called him Goose for short.
Can you say anything?
Hey, this is Will from Western Massachusetts. I'm a doctor out here, and unfortunately we've had to quarantine from most people because of that. And things have been really difficult this year, like they have been for lots of people. But at one point, right when I was getting ready to go to work, about 6:30 p.m., I'm a nocturnist, and my wife's feeling frustrated and a little lonely, totally understandably. Our daughter, who's, I don't know how many months old at that point, but a little over a year, just decided to stand up and walk across the living room for the first time. And it was like this magical being from another universe just kind of like entered the house and became ambulatory. And we both started tearing up, kind of laughing hysterically. It was like this kind of tear in the fabric of our day-to-day life that was so welcome.
I've heard that piece of audio several dozen times at least, and it still affects me emotionally. And it just shows the power of audio, the way that it creates pictures in your mind. We used to have an expression in public radio, the driveway moment. And the driveway moment was when you were listening to something so compelling on the radio that you couldn't get out of your car. You had to sit in the driveway and listen to the end of it. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how audio, particularly transmitted audio from somewhere far away, affects us. And of course, that era begins with the telephone. We can't really even imagine what it would have been like to talk on a phone to someone for the first time. They were so far away, yet they were right there in your ear. And telephones show us the magic of radio. Phone calls have changed my life. I was in a phone booth, remember them? On 1980 on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. I looked out over the Atlantic Ocean where the people at KUOW Radio in Portland, Oregon told me I had a job there as news director. It caused me to move across the country. I've lived here ever since. It changed my life. Think about phone calls that have changed your life, and maybe you could talk to me about them a little bit later. Calling someone for a first date, a phone call from a doctor, a phone call from an employer. My wife calls her brothers every week, and she says, as soon as they say just a few words, she instantly knows how they're feeling. Perhaps you have that experience with people you talk to, the power of audio. As amazing as the phone was, it was still just one person talking to another person connected by a wire. And most of my talk today is going to be about one person talking to many via audio technology. And of course, that era began in 1920. Behold in all of its glory, the mahogany Philco music radio cabinet and carved wood case. If you lean in and look closely, that forest scene in the middle is needlepoint. In the early days, radios were a treasured piece of furniture that everyone would gather around. And radio was the first audio technology I'll talk about today. The first broadcast station went on the air in 1920, so we've really just begun the second century of radio. And all at once, you could communicate to masses of people instantly. Radio collapsed space and time. And it was so new, there was no word for what radio did. So they appropriated a word from agriculture. Broadcasting was originally a term for spreading seeds. By 1927, it was what you did with radio. You disseminated speeches, etc., via radio waves. It's difficult to imagine the impact radio had when it first came on. It sparked the imagination of everyone who encountered it. The radio was the first medium to connect masses of people across huge geographic areas at once. And hearing those voices was magical. A newspaper story from those earlier years wrote of a man who set up a radio in his home so his friends could dance to a music show. When the Naughty Waltz came on, we started to dance. It was great fun. One girl thought it was eerie. It was just like a seance, she said. A seance. It was like voices from beyond, from the dead. That was how radical it was and how it affected people. With a new medium, every time you have a new medium, it's going to affect people in different ways. And often it gets blamed for the social ills of the day. For example, I believe it was Socrates who, when writing first came into place, the Greek philosopher said, this is going to ruin everything. Now that people can write things down, they're not going to remember things in their mind. And radio was no different than any of that. It got blamed for all kinds of social ills. It got blamed for drought. It got blamed for rainfall. Residents once asked the radio be suspended for a month because it was raining too much. They thought if they stopped doing radio, they wouldn't get the rain. Also, it got blamed for loud talking because people, to be heard over the din of radio in their home, would speak more loudly. This might be true. The one on the right, a librarian said radio was keeping people out of the libraries, and that probably is true. Radio got blamed for the large blue splotches on a San Francisco woman's faces, and a newspaper found that worthy of a story. British Lord Dewar said radio was killing his racing pigeons. And basically, radio was blamed for everything. Anything that went wrong in the early decades of the last century, it was radio. And of course, subsequently, it was TV, and now it's the internet. But some people recognize the power of radio. Politicians recognize the control of radio as a means of social control. And in most countries, all radio was a state-run service. So in liberal democracies like Great Britain, you've got a respected news service like the BBC. In Nazi Germany, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels led the charge to create a radio cheap enough that even workers could own one, all the better to spread propaganda. In 1994, the genocidal massacre in Rwanda that cost as many as 800,000 Tutsi deaths were spurred on by radio broadcasts urging the Hutu majority to begin killing their neighbors. Most revolutions of the last century began with seizing control of the radio station. Now, the United States was different. The US allowed private businesses to control radio. This was not a given. Many felt that the power was too important to turn over to the marketplace. Then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover said, "It is inconceivable that we should allow so great a possibility for service to be drowned out and advertising chatter. Inconceivable. And yet, as we know, that's the way that it went. It's hard today to imagine when all media is saturated by ads, but in the early days of radio, it was kind of unclear how the medium could be commercialized. It took several years for business people to realize that if you touted a product or a service or an idea on radio, maybe added a clever jingle, perhaps some humor, and repeated it over and over and over, it moved people to buy the product. And so there was a lucrative business in selling airtime to advertisers. But what do you put between the ads? Well, you put on the radio the biggest stars of stage, screen, and music to pull in the audience. When you've got people's attention, you could sell ads and make a fortune. It's hard to conceive today when we have the internet and TV and radio all competing for our attention. But for decades, radio was it. Radio was the mass medium. There's a wonderful exhibit at the Kitsap County Historical Museum with a radio and a card says, radio, the center of the home, because that's where everyone gathered. It was also the biggest engine of culture. Radio helped to spread jazz, classical, and country music across the country. Musicians like Artie Shaw, Marian Anderson, and Hank Williams, Charlie Parker, they were already known for their recordings, but radio brought them performing right into your living room. Radio comedy and drama became the primary entertainment, spelling the end of vaudeville. Orson Welles, who you see there on the right, played the Shadow, Lamont Cranston. He co-founded the Mercury Theater, and in 1938, they did a radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds. It was very cleverly done. It was a music program, and in the middle of the music program, they dropped in fake news bulletins talking about first just some strange happenings, and later on, creatures from Mars invading. In Concrete, Washington, where I gave this presentation, there was a power outage during War of the Worlds broadcast, and the people completely freaked out. That's how powerful radio was. During World War II, radio took on a new role as a trusted news source. This guy is Edward R. Murrow, the revered radio newsman. He became a national figure, broadcasting live from London rooftops during the Blitz in World War II, vividly describing the searchlights, panning the sky, looking for the Nazi bombers. In the 50s, Murrow did a blistering expose of Senator Joe McCarthy that helped to end the Red Scare. Murrow attended college at what later became Washington State University, and WSU now has the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication, and it's the home of Northwest Public Broadcasting. For those of you who spend time in Eastern Washington, you've probably heard some of their stations if you're a public radio fan. The arrival of television beginning in the 1950s changed radio, but as you could hear from that Stan Freberg bit at the beginning, there was a fear that TV would wipe out radio. That didn't happen. Radio just evolved. The big stars of the day did go from radio to TV, but radio created their own stars. Paul Harvey, Rush Limbaugh, Alan Freed, Wolfman Jack. Radio stations played to the medium's strength, music formats and news. And also it was always live and you didn't have to be looking at a screen. So live sports events and call-in radio became very popular. And radio became hyper-local. In the beginning, there were large networks across the country, but in the Midwest, radio stations began to specialize in what their audiences wanted. Commodity prices, detailed weather reports for farmers. In urban areas, traffic reports came vital. And everybody listened to the weather because kids, not that long ago, you couldn't look it up instantly on your phone. Imagine that. For many of us, radio is synonymous with driving. So much radio listening takes place in the commutes. People in broadcasting call them drive times. Commuting in bad traffic had been a boon to radio listening. Legend has it that the idea for car radio was born in 1929. Two young men named William Lear and Elmer Wavering drove their girlfriends to a lookout point high above the Mississippi River town of Quincy, Illinois, to watch the sunset. One of the women said, "Wouldn't it be nice if they could listen to music in the car?" And that set Wavering and Lear off on a path of adventure. The path to the first car radio was not at all smooth. They needed a loan to convince a local banker to give them the money. So they got the bright idea of installing their first working model in the banker's Studebaker to show off the technology. About a half hour after the installation, the banker's Packard caught on fire. They did not get the loan. But they persisted, and they teamed up with manufacturer Paul Galvin, owner of the Galvin Manufacturing Company. Galvin got a radio installed in his Studebaker, which fortunately did not catch fire, and he drove almost 800 miles to the 1930 Radio Manufacturers Association convention. He couldn't afford a booth, so he parked his car outside the convention hall right near the entrance, and he cranked up the radio. And everyone walking by were going, "What's this coming out of this car?" So they came over to take a look at it. The idea worked, and he got orders to put the radio into production, and the rest is history. Galvin wanted a catchy name, and at the time, the 1930s, many companies in the phonograph and radio business were using the suffix "ola" for their names. So Radiola, Columbiola, Victrola. So Galvin decided to do the same thing. And since his radio was for a motor vehicle, he decided to call it the Motorola. And he changed the name of his company, the Galvin Manufacturing Company, to Motorola. Now we're still talking about AM radio, but soon audio transmission technology changed. I could have played Steely Dan's FM here, but if you get the reference, it's already playing in your head. The new technology, of course, FM radio. The broadcast signal had a much higher quality. The first FM station went on the air March 1st, 1941. But to hear FM, you had to have an FM radio. Radio didn't begin to catch on until the 50s and 60s because few people had FM radios. They didn't really have a reason to buy one. They didn't know what was on the radio. So uptake was very slow at first. That meant that radio frequencies were readily available. So universities and colleges, Washington State University, the University of Washington, even high schools like Seattle's Nathan Hale grabbed up FM channels. Many churches grabbed up FM channels to promote the gospel. In the 1960s, the cultural uprising around the newly empowered youth generation, the protests against the Vietnam War, and the surge of rock and roll was the sound of what became known as underground radio, like this station from Boston. Commercial stations like WBCN, Pacifica listener-sponsored station networks like KPFA in San Francisco, WBAI in New York helped to lead the youth movement. And people also began to reconsider what radio could do. It could be a public service. It could create and serve an informed public. And in that spirit, in 1967, President Lyndon Johnson and Congress created a funding mechanism for public media. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting funds public media. The original draft of the legislation funding public broadcasting was only for public TV. Then at the very last minute, there was a change. The word television got scratched out and replaced by broadcasting in the legislation, creating the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, allowing for funding of TV and radio. National Public Radio was created in 1970. And by the way, NPR no longer stands for National Public Radio. It's just NPR because it's not only a provider of radio, but also web streaming and podcasts. The word radio is considered a little old-fashioned now amongst broadcasters because they disseminate their audio through so many media. The first broadcast from NPR was live coverage of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations hearings into the Vietnam War. And the first daily program NPR produced was All Things Considered. It went on the air 51 years ago, April 20th, 1971. And this is something from the very first broadcast of All Things Considered.
Thousands of young people came to Washington willing to risk being arrested in order to end the war. They went into the streets this morning to stop the government from functioning by clogging many Washington roads during this morning's rush hour. For many demonstrators, the mobile street tactics of civil disobedience are an expected spring event. But before today, many other young people who came to Washington had not been willing to oppose the state with their bodies. For these young Americans, today was a major test of their commitment to the ethical code of the young and the angry. It was their Freedom Ride, their Selma March, their May Day.
Stop the war now! 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 Stop the war now!
A line of young people has just come across the highway. Traffic is stopped. And here come the police. 1, 2, 3, 4 police on motor scooters. One demonstrator knocked down by a motor scooter policeman. Anger now. Anger of the young people.
Motor 3 on the Southwest Freeway. Have one injured down here. Could you send me an ambulance, please? It's right at Main Avenue.
And he hit the kid. He went right through the line.
Past me and almost knocked me down. And a blue...
Yeah, but it's policeman we're talking about.
Motorcycle.
Policeman.
Motorcycle
hit
hit
him,
him, not a citizen.
Right there, the man over there, right there.
Sergeant, excuse me, Jeff Kamen, National Public Radio. Is that a technique where the men actually try to drive the bikes into the demonstrators?
No, it's no technique. We're trying to go down the road and the people get in front. What are you going to do? You don't stop on a dime.
The very first All Things Considered 51 years ago. And many of the stylistic elements of public radio and later podcasting are already there in the very first All Things Considered. There's the use of natural sound. There's the narrator describing what he's seeing. There's voices that sounded like people. The announcers didn't all sound like the voice of God, which was kind of the Edward R. Murrow tradition. Since AM and FM radio, there have been many other sound transmission technologies. sort of attempted sound transmission technologies, I should say. First, ham or amateur radio. It allows one person to talk long distances to someone else. And ham radio has been a crucial technology when other forms of communication have been down. Citizens band, CB radio, these radio transmitter receivers, very popular in the 80s among long distance truckers. They allowed you to broadcast over shorter distances on a set channel. Now, I'm less familiar with CB and ham, so if some of you are familiar with those technologies, maybe you still are a ham radio operator, please pipe up at the end of this talk. I'd like to hear about your experiences. And then over the last 10 years, the Federal Communication Commission has allowed more FM stations broadcasting at low power between the existing stations to go on the air, low power FM. You don't reach as far, so mainly they're in cities, so you don't have to reach very far to get to listeners. There's one in the Central District. I don't know if there's one in West Seattle, but if there is, and maybe you're affiliated with it, tell us all about it. I'd like to hear from those of you who are involved in FM radio. Then kind of an interesting failed technology. FM radios work by transmitting signal via frequency wave modulation. FM is short for frequency modulation. AM used amplitude modulation. But in 2002, the kind of brilliant idea came up to send audio via digital transmission, zeros and ones, yet even more of an improvement in the quality. But like with FM, you needed a new radio that could pick up on HD. So HD radio never really caught on. Now, what I've been talking about so far are radio towers transmitting locally. But in the 1990s, radio transmitters went into space. They were in orbit around the Earth. The first satellite radio broadcasts were in Africa and the Middle East in 1999, sparsely populated areas where it's hard to place enough antennas to reach people. The next evolution of audio transmission technology began right in Seattle with this guy. Rob Glazer left his job at Microsoft to found Progressive Networks in 1994. And the goal was to provide distribution for politically progressive audio content. They produced audio programming you couldn't get very much other places on the radio. But the innovative thing was that they distributed it over the internet. What caught on was not the political content, it was the distribution of audio via the internet and a technology we now know as streaming. Streaming has pretty much transcended broadcasting. Glazer pivoted to streaming technology and rebranded from Progressive Networks to Real Networks. And the breakthrough technology was a little widget called the Real Player. And suddenly the computer could speak. I can remember the first time I heard it, and it was kind of amazing to me. It was glitchy and scratchy over 300 baud modems, if you remember them, but the radio could talk. And as computers and internet connections got faster, audio quality improved rapidly. One of the earliest internet transmitted events was a baseball game between the New York Yankees and the Seattle Mariners, September 5th, 1995. Besides listening live, audio over internet technology allowed you to download an audio file and listen to it at your leisure. It was the audio equivalent of a video cassette recorder that allowed you to record TV shows and watch at a convenient time. Listening became untethered from time, and the podcast was born. The first podcast was October 2003, a weekly musical talk show hosted by Matt Schichter called The Backstage Pass. In June 2005, Apple released a new version of their music app, iTunes 4.9, and that made it easy to find and download not just music, but also podcasts. It would not only play on your computer, but also on portable devices like Apple's iPod. By the way, that's how podcasts got their name. It's a mashup of iPod and broadcast. In 2014, this podcast really popularized podcasts for the masses.
This is a Global CalLink prepaid call from
Adnan Sayed,
an inmate at a Maryland Correctional Facility.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial, one story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig. For the last year, I've spent every working day trying to figure out where a high school kid was for an hour after school one day in 1999. Or if you want to get technical about it, and apparently I do, where a high school kid was for 21 minutes after school one day in 1999. This search sometimes feels undignified on my part. I've had to ask about teenagers' sex lives, where, how often, with whom, about notes they passed in class, about their drug habits, their relationships with their parents. And I am not a detective or a private investigator. I'm not even a crime reporter. But yes, every day this year, I've tried to figure out the alibi of a 17-year-old boy.
Over the next 12 one-hour episodes, Sarah Koenig walked us through the evidence in this murder case. It told a compelling story. Sarah Koenig became a character, talking us through her doubts and her research. And you could even hear it in the opening moments of that podcast. Very self-referential. You really connect with her as a person. She's kind of not talking to you as an expert. She's talking to you as someone who's just looking into something, maybe with some investigative skills, but no credentials to do that. Serial was a huge success. Within a month, Serial was the fastest podcast ever to reach 5 million downloads. And by the end of December, it had been downloaded 40 million times. 22 years later, on September 19th of this year, a Baltimore judge ordered the release of that man on the left, Adnan Syed. He was the person who was accused in this murder. His conviction was overturned for the 1999 murder of high school student Hai-Min Lee, and partly because of Serial, that podcast. So what was it about the sound of Serial and podcasting that's different from radio? How does it attract people? Well, it was a new way to present audio information, and it created a new listening experience. Rebecca Mead wrote in The New Yorker that great podcasts presented an audio narrative that can be immersive in a way that radio playing in the background rarely is. Podcasts are designed to take up time rather than to be checked and scanned and rushed through. Now, if we were in person, I would say how many people listen to podcasts. I'm often surprised that very few people in the audiences do, sometimes maybe a third of the audience, but most people are not. You are not alone. 45% of Americans have never listened to podcasts, but that number is dropping rapidly. There are 800 million people listening to podcasts, and the number of podcasts is increasing astronomically. As of December 2020, Apple hosted 1.68 million podcasts. Here are the most popular ones. The Joe Rogan Experience is on Spotify, an audio content streaming service. It was in the news a few months ago because Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, and other musicians objected to COVID-19 misinformation being propagated on Rogan's program, so they asked to have their music taken off Spotify. The Daily from the New York Times also airs as a radio show. I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful way of taking a look at the news. So often, news is going by so quickly. The Daily kind of stops time and for a half hour takes a look at something in the news and takes you back to the very origins of it up to the present and kind of catches you up and gives you the background. Since Serial, true crime podcasts like Crime Junkie and My Favorite Murder have taken off. Some of you may be familiar with This American Life, which began as a public radio program. It's also a podcast now, very popular. Stuff You Should Know is exactly that. Episodes has explained champagne, Satanism, the Stonewall Uprising, and chaos theory. Office Ladies is a podcast about the TV show, The Office, with two of the stars, Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsey. Ben Shapiro is a conservative commentary program. Podcasts are a boon to anybody with an idea who wants to reach a large audience directly, instead of having to go to work for a radio station or a radio network. The internet connects you to a potential worldwide audience. The key word here is potential. You can create something with a personal voice and talk about the stories that fascinate you, but so do a lot of other people. It's a very crowded marketplace. But it is a concern for radio broadcasters. The radio audience has been contracting for some time now, and one reason is that there's a lot of other ways to listen aside from radio. It's pretty easy to do a podcast if you know kind of the basics of technology: a microphone, a computer, a high-speed internet connection, an audio recorder, digital audio editing software, and you're good to go. The ease of podcasting and the increased numbers of users has led to everyone and her sister starting podcasts. If you're a celebrity, chances are you've been on podcasts or you have your own podcast. Anyone interested in anything, from bird calls to politics, to knitting, to true crime, to music, can find multiple podcasts by people who share your obsession. Now, 2014, along with being the birthday of Serial, and kind of the beginning of the big age of podcasts, was also the year that Amazon launched a brand new type of device that radically changed audio technology. As you're probably aware, artificial technology has reached the level so that computers can understand speech. When you pick up your phone now, you can click on that little microphone icon and say, "Call Harriet," instead of having to dial in the number. Well, in 2014, Amazon introduced the smart speaker that responds to questions and commands with answers and actions. These are smart speakers from Amazon, Sonos, Apple, Google, and others. I've got one of the Amazons. It's that hockey puck in the lower right-hand corner. So what's a smart speaker? It's something that will respond to your questions. Artificial intelligence understands what you're saying and then comes up with an answer for it. Sadly, these so-called smart speakers are not always very bright. And one of the things I'd like you to talk about is whether you have a smart speaker. Some people like to use them, have their kids use them. Some people like have them for their grandparents. People who might be alone have something to talk to. Technically, smart speakers are always hearing, but makers say they're not listening to your conversations unless you use a wake-up word like "Okay Google" or "Hey Siri" or Alexa. So how many people have smart speakers in the US? Smart speaker use is growing rapidly.
Okay.
It's quintupled.
This on the web or Alexa. So how many?
This is just an example of when you say the wake-up word, your telephone will start to wake up. So we're going to shut that off. Smart speaker use is rising rapidly. It's quintupled in just the last 2 years. But still, as you can see from this graph, 2/3 of Americans don't have a smart speaker. And one of the big concerns is privacy. Just over 1 year, the number of people moderately or very concerned about smart speaker privacy has gone up sharply. My wife is always worried when that little hockey puck is listening. And there is actually good reason for suspicion. In 2018, this is kind of amazing, still having a hard time getting my head around it. The Amazon Echo sent private audio recorded in a home to someone on their owner's contact list without permission. Imagine you're having a conversation in your home, and a few minutes later, when the conversation is over, someone calls you from across the country and said, "I just got sent to me audio of recording of you talking to your wife." It happened. They say it was rare, it would never happen again. It's a basic equation, convenience versus privacy. Despite the concerns, convenience appears to be winning out, with sales rising rapidly. So I'm really curious about what you think about devices that listen and talk back to you and hear you. For those of you who are radio fans, internet streaming has created an amazing app for your phone or computer. It's called Radio Garden. And what it does is it displays a view of the world in a globe. This is kind of a primitive version of it. You can spin the globe and zoom in on anywhere on Earth, go to Kyiv. Then it allows you to see all the radio stations broadcasting in that local area. And you can click on that and listen to those radio stations. It's the equivalent of having a radio which can tune in the entire world. And if I leave you with anything to explore when it comes to audio, Radio Garden is one of the ones I really recommend that you check out. It's an app you can download onto your phone and immediately be listening to audio radio anywhere in the world, not just broadcast stations, but there are many radio stations that are only streaming on the internet. You can listen to any of that on Radio Garden. That and podcasts are two things that not as many people as I would like are familiar with, and they could really broaden your world and really be something that can improve your life. So what's on the horizon? There's a few trends to look at for audio transmission in the coming years. You remember I mentioned that first broadcast to stream over the internet was that Seattle Mariners game. Well, that took a lot of organizing. There are several apps that make it easy for you to do a talk show or DJ a music show on your phone and send it out to the world. It's called social audio and live transmission audio you can sign up for. These apps have also been called audio-only chat apps. You can be the DJ or the talk show host, and potentially you could reach anyone in the world. It's kind of a live version of a podcast. Celebrities like Elon Musk and Bill Gates are already on these apps, so good luck getting attention for your music or talk show. Spotify has Green Room. Amazon has a new one called AMP. Clubhouse is an independent company, which if current tech trends continue, it'll be purchased by Apple or some other giant before we finish talking. So one of the things I've learned from doing a radio talk show over 20 years is that there's always someone in the audience who knows more than me. So I didn't know the derivation of the word podcast until someone on one of these sessions who worked for Apple enlightened me in an earlier presentation. So if there's some big points I missed that you'd like to share and talk about, please do so, or just share some of your radio stories. What did you listen to in radio? Are there memorable moments of listening to radio that you really would like to recall for us? Is there a particular radio that was memorable to you? Also, podcasts, and I haven't really talked much about books on tape, but we had a really interesting discussion in one of these sessions with a literature professor who talked about her students listening to books on tape rather than reading the books. And we had a little discussion, is that cheating? Is that really reading? So what attracts you to that audio? What's some of the audio that you've heard from somewhere that really changed your world? Do you talk to your phone instead of using your thumbs? Do you use a smart speaker, or would you? Why or why not? Those are the things I like to talk about. One other thing, though, I'd like to leave you with is kind of a suggested reading list. There are several books that I found incredibly useful. Eric Barnow's History of Early Radio is a colorful portrayal of a unique moment in human history, the birth of mass media. And the stories are just amazing because you realized what the before era was like. And you get an idea of how the mass media coming online all of a sudden changed everything immediately. People's confusion about it. Marshall McLuhan's theory of media is heavy reading, but his thoughts are summarized in an entertaining graphic work. That's the medium is the massage. And then Brooke Gladstone is the host of On the Media, one of the best shows on public radio, also a podcast, of course. It takes on the history of news in this illustrated book. Jill Abramson focuses on how news has changed because of the changes in technology from newspapers to the web and to social media. So enough of me. Hopefully I've got you thinking about how audio transmission has changed your life. If you've got questions, I'll try to answer them. But tell me about the radio shows or stations that you listen to and why. Has that changed over the years? How about podcasts or books on tape? Is listening to a book cheating? I'd like to hear about your experience with smart speakers or why you don't want to try out smart speakers. It's a whole new form of audio transmission that's two-way. Listen to you and respond. Are you comfortable talking to a machine and having it answer back? Are you comfortable having your kids talking to a smart speaker? And are any of you early adopters of social audio? Are you setting up your own radio talk or music show? If you've worked in radio, or maybe you're at one of the low power FM stations, I'd love to hear your story about how that's working out for you. Let's talk about how audio transmission has changed our lives. So you can jump in right now on the chat or on the Q&A, or if you just like to turn on your microphone and ask your question, feel free to do so.
I'm going to jump in while people type in their questions. I don't know that they can, in the webinar format on Zoom, that they can turn on their audio. I think it's all Q&A.
Okay.
But I'm curious what you think makes a good podcast. What have you found that makes a really good podcast? The list that you had there, I'm familiar with the Crooked Media and the New York Times and listened to some of Serial. But what is your thought about what makes a really good podcast?
It's really personal and really specific. Because it can be specific. When I was doing a daily radio show on KUOW, I had to think about it's going to be going out to a large number of people, and those are people who all sort of different interests. So I need to try to figure out topics that I could think would work broadly for a large number of people. But if you're doing a podcast, you can just focus on some minutiae that you're fascinated with. And the storytelling is much different also. As you could kind of tell from that brief clip that I played, the people who are doing podcasts get very personal in what they're talking about. They also go on and on and on. There are some interview podcasts that are the most popular. Mark Maron, for example, a podcast called WTF, you might know what that stands for. He'll basically interview someone for an hour and a half, as does Joe Rogan. So they go into great depth and they sort of pull you in, and they're not something you kind of tune into and tune out of. Why would you bother to tune in or out of a podcast? Because you could just flip to another podcast.
Well, Dorothy, I'll turn the Q&A over to you because I think there's some comments there.
Oh, I see them here. Richard writes to us. He says, I'm an engineer working on new mobile devices. Your concern about privacy is understated. Richard says, Orwell's 1984 has become reality. The public needs to know that the entire presumption of privacy seems to have eroded, which is absolutely true. Anytime your device is connected to the internet, there's going to be a way for someone else to be able to tap into it in some way, shape, or form. There's so much of our lives that have moved on to it, not just our spoken words, etc. So you should not presume privacy. There are those, at the same time, it's difficult to imagine not sacrificing some of your privacy to some of the convenience that you're able to get via the use of the internet. Not just with audio, but I'm also thinking of simple things like banking or ways that you're able to work with finances on the internet. So yeah, there's going to be some questions of privacy there, and presumably they'll be able to reassure you enough that your privacy isn't being violated. Some of you may be concerned about privacy also when it comes to some of these technologies. Share your concerns with me. Richard, it sounds like you have some of them. Please add something in if you'd like to do that.
Well, I have another question while we wait
Sure.
for other questions to come up. Tell us a little bit about how you got, a little bit more about how you got into broadcasting. What happened? What happened to you?
Well, when I was in college, I started doing a music program on my college radio station called the Alternative Alarm Clock, and I got to play the Sex Pistols and then Debussy. I got to mix everything together. It was a lot of fun to do. So I graduated from college. I was looking for a job. I tried working in import-export documentation for a company that manufactured turbines in Worcester, Massachusetts. So back in the day, you didn't do everything on a computer. You had very elaborate forms you had to fill out. So I worked on that documentation so they could export these turbines to Hyderabad. Hated it, hated working in the office, didn't like the environment at all. Quit, thought I could do better. Got a job at a hi-fi store. Got fired from that because I was terrible at it. I was awful at it. And so I just began to think backwards. Well, what is important in my life? And I realized this radio station I was working at was important. I really enjoyed doing it, enjoyed being on the radio, doing radio broadcasting. So what happened was that I asked the people at the radio station, could I get a job? And they said, no, we don't have any money. You can't get a job. But would you like to try writing a grant? And maybe your grant proposal could enable you to get some paid work here. So I wrote a grant proposal up about a program about the police in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is where I lived at the time. Didn't get the grant, but by that time, I guess I demonstrated that I had a sincere interest in doing this kind of a thing. So out of the blue, they kind of hired me, completely unqualified, aside from my interest, and they called me the News and Public Affairs Director at WCUW in Worcester, Massachusetts. And from there, I kind of just worked with it. I really got involved in public radio in an amazing time in the early 70s. It was before national public radio became what it is today. And if you had the wherewithal and the energy to get involved in something, you could become a news and public affairs director with almost no experience whatsoever. So I went to conferences. I gradually improved my skill set. I worked with a number of different people. I worked with the Pacifica Radio Network. I can remember selling my first story to the BBC World Service, and gradually selling a spot to NPR. Those were big landmarks in my career. And that's how it all got started, from being a failure everywhere else. As things sometimes happen, you sort of realize in a backwards way what you're interested in, what you care about.
It's very interesting how you get started. I think Richard's got a few more comments here.
Oh, Richard asks if we want to do an interview. I'd love to have you turn your mic on and just start talking, Richard, but apparently we can't do that with this technology. But on the subject of privacy, there's a lot to be said about it. But I think even more interesting than the question of privacy and these new technologies is the question of accuracy and truth and these new technologies. It's no mystery, or it's not news to anyone to realize that we are living in very different realities in this country. Go to other parts of the country and they think completely differently about elections, about leadership, about democracy. And the reason for this is that in some ways, it's an advantage that there are many other media outlets that are presenting more information. But in the process, we've gotten into the social media area, which I haven't really talked too much about. But of course, many of the podcasts that are transmitted are purely the opinion and views of people who are on them. They can talk in a reasonable voice and sound very credible. But what's occurred here is that there are no kind of dependable sources of information for many people these days. They don't really have a way to suss out what is accurate and what is not accurate. They don't believe the mass media. And in some ways, I can kind of understand that. There are many examples of the most trusted media, the New York Times booting the story about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So you could usually see that, yeah, the mass media gets it wrong. The so-called mainstream media gets it wrong. However, people are throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And they're saying that all news media is corrupt because they're being told that over and over and over and over again by political leaders. So what that effectively has done is created uncertainty and about how do I believe what's going on? What do I believe? And people, because they don't have all day to go online and to research things, they're not always familiar with what's the difference between a credible source and not a credible source. And frankly, because journalists have completely failed at telling people how they do their work and telling them what goes on with a story when it's produced, how editors question reporters, how there's a dynamic tension going on to get to as close to the truth as you possibly can. And there's also a facet of online, which applies to anything online, streaming, et cetera, that's different from broadcasters. If I was doing my talk radio show and someone called in and slandered someone else, we as a radio station were responsible for that. However, if you slander someone or libel someone in an online forum, the people who run that online forum, be it Facebook or Twitter, or whatever, are not responsible for it. That's a very deliberate part of the law that was set up in the Communications Act. And the reason for that was it was felt as though we want to encourage people to use these social networks. And if we require the people who run the social networks to vet everything that goes on them, that'll inhibit their growth. So in one sense, that's worked out really well. They've become very freewheeling sources of information going forward. But on the other hand, the problem with that is that there's so much misinformation going on, and it's kind of undermined accurate, realistic information. So it's become a real difficult facet of it. So as much as privacy is a concern to me, I'm even more concerned about like where the truth lies now and how people find out about the truth, and how people need to understand that a lot of things that are coming across as the truth are lies.
Ross, we have
Yes.
another question come in, and Richard Schilling says that he made arrangements and he can talk. So let me
Great.
ask this other question, and then we'll wait for Richard to check in.
Okay.
I think I might. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, very good. So I can, whatever you would like to start, just go ahead. Oh.
Well, I'll just respond to this one question, and then we'll get to you, Richard. This is public radio is fantastic, writes SS, but it also makes up a small section of our radio dials. I understand that some podcasts are now subscription-based. Do you think that radio and broadcasting is at a risk of being fee-based or otherwise behind a paywall? Great question. Clearly, there are many outlets that are proving to be popular. They're trying to figure out ways to monetize it. In public radio, we used to have the pledge drive, which was a kind of uncomfortable way for many people to have to listen to radio and to do radio. But you have to make money to do what you're doing. So how do you do that? It's going to be a tricky question, because some places that have tried fee-based serving information, including the New York Times, have retreated from it and then moved forward on it, because most people, certainly people who listen to the radio, are not used to paying for it. People who listen to podcasts are not used to paying for it. So what benefit can you provide them? They're trying to think of add-ons they can provide. So, for example, they won't run any ads within the podcast if you pay a certain fee. Well, that's definitely a benefit. I could see how that would work out really well. I wish that public radio was able to do the same thing. So when you pledge your support to public radio, you could get a channel where you didn't have to hear the pledge drive any longer. Wouldn't that be awesome? So right now we're looking at how broadcasting is going to be able to pay for itself. The audience is shrinking. The overall audience for radio is shrinking because people are going to other media outlets. So how are they going to be able to pay for it? And my own alma mater, KUOW, is starting podcasts. They're trying to create that as an outlet. They're trying to go where people are. If people are listening to podcasts and not radio, well, let's give them podcasts. But it's an open question right now as the audience continues to shrink, and we'll see what the future holds. Will radio survive the podcast and streaming era? That's kind of a big question right now. Looking at the past, you'd have to say, yes, it will adapt in some way, but at the same time, there's so much competition now, it's kind of a question. Anyway, Richard, that was a long response to that. Join the conversation. What did you want to add to it?
Well, it's interesting, and thank you very much for working in radio all these years. Yeah, I do listen to you on the show, and I recognized your name when this announcement came up. So, my wife and I had to be here today. Where do we begin with this privacy issue? It is such a different world now. And I'll give you an example. So I build mobile devices, and I work on them at the lowest levels. So I'm very familiar with the issues that you speak of, both legally as well as technologically. I'm one of these rare beasts that have a computer science degree and an MBA. So I get it. I understand the whole scope of what's going on here. I'll give you an example. There's a misconception that the government is spying on everybody, and that's not true. but it's not true for a very interesting reason. It's not considered spying if you can just buy the data, or if you have a contractor that's a company that buys the data for you and analyzes it for you. It's not spying. And what people don't realize is that when they sign the contract for their mobile phone, what they're doing is they're giving away the data that they generate to the company. It's not even their data anymore.
Well, I noticed lately, you've probably seen this too, Richard, is that certain websites will give you an option. Are you okay with having the information shared with other outlets? And you can click no on it. And I think that's an advance. It may be a very small advance, but there are now some ways that you can protect your information and make it more privately yours. But as you know, there's been a long time movement for why should others be able to profit from you? Why should, if you're on Facebook, why should someone else be able to profit from that? Why shouldn't you be able to share in that? And there are many interesting theories about how to create systems whereby the individual cannot give up that privacy, that information of theirs that they're sharing if they go onto a website. There are also, and you might know more about this than I do, Richard, there are some search engines and some websites and some mechanisms whereby you can kind of keep your privacy more by paying a little extra for a certain type of connection.
Well, that's definitely true. And that's an interesting dilemma. And honestly, I would love to see some great reporting to continue to cover this topic because it's so pervasive. But basically, the most powerful thing that we have as citizens, I would observe, it can also be our greatest weakness, and that is the power of a contract. So once you sign a contract with a company, whether it's the end user license agreement, that is in effect law. So if you have a contract with a company that says the data I generate is mine, and you will store it correctly and you will secure it on my behalf, that is the rules of the road. Companies like Microsoft will do that. If you go and pay for cloud storage, that essentially is what you are doing. However, the companies out there that are trying to make money and survive don't make money that way. And so when companies are created to actually generate revenue in a sustainable way, based on the idea that the customer owns the data, then you'll start to see some traction.
Yes,
perhaps.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't know if I'd like to see whether that could move forward in that, but the end use license agreements, the ULIs that we all have to sign off on for numerous things we do online, as anyone who's looked at them knows, they're require a lot of reading. They're completely incomprehensible. They go on for pages and pages. And I
South Park has an amazing episode about that, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, you just check yes. And frankly, how often is there any? I think there'd be a natural corrective. I still think there is enough strong media coverage of these privacy issues that if there were serious breaches in privacy and people were losing information or losing money or being adversely affected, I think you would know about it. And I think that the bad publicity from that would steer people away from those places. People are already going away from places like Facebook and Twitter because they don't like Elon Musk or they're concerned about the policies of Facebook. So there is a certain public pressure that can be applied once you become nervous about something, because you are so trusting when you're involved in these, when you get a cell phone. You are sharing so much information, and your basic agreement is what I talked about a bit earlier. It's convenience versus privacy. And if it's super convenient, most people tend to be willing to sacrifice a little bit on privacy.
That's very true. And one of the things that confounds me as a professional that's worked in this field for over 25 years, 30 years or so, is no matter how many data breaches happen, people rarely use their ability to put pressure on a company to demand better.
But why do you think that is? Why, if have you ever had your data breached?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I had last year, I had somebody go online and open up a bank account in Illinois in my name. They had my social security number and name and everything, and deposit $250 in the account. And the only reason I knew about it was because the bank sent me a debit card. So I reported it to the police, locked the account down, etc. So I use the tools available to me. But my personal theory and this is just a theory, is it's convenient in an odd way. People will respond to something when it affects them directly. So there's two issues at play. One, if your company is processing data outside of the United States and the data is breached, it hasn't violated any laws in the United States. So it's not a breach in the United States. But at the same time, if the person never understands that they were breached or has never been affected by it, they'll tend to ignore it. They
Sure,
just
and-
accept it.
And that's why you see all these stories about data breaches. Millions of pieces of data and information have been whisked away by someone who was able to hack into an account. But then I never see the follow-up story, which is of these millions of things that were bits of data that were stolen, how many people lost anything because of that? It does happen, as you mentioned in your own personal experience. It definitely does happen. My brother-in-law had his identity stolen. It took him a long time to try to get that fixed. But it doesn't appear as though it's happening so often that the public is rising up and asking for some kind of legal solution to it.
Well, I think
Dorothea,
media has a role to play there,
Yes.
actually, in motivating people around that. That's a very long story as well. There's some human nature
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
that can found.
Ross, I want to jump in.
Sure.
There's a couple of other questions waiting, and thank you, Richard, for
Thank you.
participating in that conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Richard.
One of your listeners, Marcy Johnson, is saying this is a very interesting presentation and thanks you. I guess you can see that now. Sharon Levine and Nancy Burke both have a comment. Do you want to read them? Or do you want me to read them?
Sure. I see that Sharon wrote, how can we determine if we're listening to an entity of artificial intelligence or not an actual human? Great question, Sharon. At the moment, I don't know if that you can. I don't know if you've seen any of the videos that have been produced, some by the University of Washington, where they had Barack Obama saying something that he never actually said, because the artificial intelligence could analyze his speech and put together the syllables in a different order to have them say anything they wanted to. If words are being put in the mouth of someone, and presumably that person is still alive, they can speak up and say, this is not accurate. So there's a whole lot of questions about like how you can discern whether it's real or not. I think, we're concerned about fake news now. I think it's only going to get worse unless we're able to be more careful and discerning about how we determine where the fake news is. Dora, you wanted to jump in also? Dorothea?
Well, I just wanted to ask more about Planet Radio. I didn't write that down quick enough.
Radio Garden. Radio Garden is the
Radio
worldwide.
Garden.
Yes,
And
Radio
how
Garden.
do you access that?
If you have a phone, you could just pull it up the App Store and put in Radio Garden. If you're
Okay,
online, you could just Google Radio Garden
All right, thank you.
and it'll pop up. And that and podcasting are the two things that I don't think enough people take advantage of.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Nancy has another comment for you.
Yeah, I see that Nancy has been talking about some of her favorite podcasts. Anything on crooked media, she says, particularly Pod Save America, Kelly Corrigan Wonders, Revisionist History with Malcolm Gladwell, which I also have listened to. I like that. Against the Rules, which is by Michael Lewis. I think it's Michael Lewis, Nancy, not John Lewis, which is part of Malcolm Gladwell's Pushkin Industries production. Also a wonderful podcast about how we don't really accept the rules makers anymore. We don't really accept the referees. We're rejecting the referees. But it's a great expansion on that idea. So let's see. Yes, Michael Lewis. So those are all great recommendations. But if you haven't gotten into podcasts, it's not that tricky to do, honestly. If you have a smartphone, it's very easy to download a podcast program that will allow you to search, and you can search via any criteria. I've given you a few ideas about podcasts to look for. And if you start asking around what people's favorite podcasts are, you'll get great ideas like Nancy has just provided to us. So check that out and check out Radio Garden. And also a shameless self-promotion. Since I left KUOW in this past January, I've been going back and listening to some of the interviews that I did over the years, both in Seattle and other places. And I've been putting them up on my own website, which is pretty easy to remember. It's rossreynolds.com. And if you go to rossreynolds.com, you'll see some of the kind of non-time dated, I think, evergreen interviews that I've done over the years with scientists, politicians, actors, actresses, thinkers, presidents, and many others who I've gotten the opportunity to talk to. And so you might want to check that out. And if you don't have enough to listen to, there's a whole other opportunity for you to listen.
You wrapped it up very nicely. There's a couple other comments there thanking you for the presentation. And Nancy, you can see, reminds us that podcasts are great to listen to while walking. Yeah,
absolutely. They make my walk so much more pleasant.
Yeah. So if there's any other questions, get them in right now, or maybe you want to call it an evening, Ross. You just did a lot of talking about a lot of things, and I wish we could, well, it is recorded, isn't it? So this presentation will be available within several weeks, I think, on our website, on the Seattle Historic Society website.
And I just put up the slide with my website, and also get in touch, rossreynolds@gmail.com, if you'd like to talk more about this or have other questions. And I really appreciate, Dora Faye, the opportunity that you've given me to talk about my favorite subject, audio transmission technology, and how it's changed the world. I hope people have gotten something out of it. I really appreciate you letting me have this opportunity. Great.
Can I throw in a quick funny thing that you reminded me of at the beginning of your talk when you were talking about what we can share? My mother was born in 1921, and I think I forget what